In my hometown of Easton, Pennsylvania, nothing stood taller than the jail on the hill. Every family had been touched by it. We all had tales of broken men in and out of lockup. Black fathers, sons, uncles, perpetually absent from graduations, weddings, birthdays, funerals. I just assumed I would end up there too. Back in high school, my friends and I were already skilled in trading narcotics, breaking and entering. We were taking what we wanted from rich white college boys, unconsciously stealing back what had long ago been taken from us. I always drove the getaway car. My best friend Tommy rode shotgun. We were young and smart, rushing fast down roads leading us closer and closer to that ominous jail on a hill. Then I read James Baldwin, and I discovered that it didn't have to be that way. Baldwin's fiery words gave me courage to dream. I applied to college. I left Easton for freedom. Tommy stayed, spending his whole adult life going in and out of jail. When I heard Tommy committed suicide, I decided to try to understand his journey through the prison system, to uncover the whole truth about the all-consuming, all-powerful, all-American jail. The prodigal son. I climbed into my car and headed home. It felt right that I was not running away, that for the first time I was driving full speed towards the jailhouse on the hill. So this is my house. Wow. This is the house I grew up in. So this corner here is where I would catch the school bus, and the first day I moved to this house, I was standing on the corner and the paper boy walked by and called me a nigger. I think it was the first time someone called me a nigger. And his mother said, don't do that because those people burn our house down. Like so many determined black women without resources, my mother cleaned the homes of well-to-do white women. She raised me with no help from my father, who had disowned us. I never felt I belonged. I wanted something more than what I could see. I wanted to be somewhere far away from that jail on a hill. Community college was the first step. Then I got a scholarship to study journalism at NYU. The stories I reported propelled me to become an independent filmmaker. Hello. Look at your hair.
I know.
Looks good.
Thank you. How you doing?
Your hair. I'm good.
It wasn't like
Back when Tommy and I were hanging out, Susie was never far away. Tommy and his older sister were inseparable. She looked after him, protected him. She was devastated when he took his own life on his 52nd birthday.
He's missed every day, because that was my first phone call of the day. He would talk to me every morning.
Wow.
He'd talk to me when he's getting Jerica ready for school. He'd talk to me on the way to take her to the bus stop.
So where's Tommy?
He's over here.
Was he depressed?
He was. Yeah, he had bouts with depression.
He also had bouts with the Eastern police.
Tommy?
Yeah.
He would drink, and somebody would call the cops because he would. When he drank, he'd get loud.
Right.
Okay, that's drunken disorder. The cops would come. They spray him with mace and handcuff him and all this. So now he's resistant, whatever they're trying to do. So they took him and put him in the tank. And they kept him there one time. I forget, was he in there for a year, 2 years, a year and a half?
What?
For nothing.
For nothing.
They didn't charge him with anything? They just held him for a year and a half?
Drunk and disorderly. That's what he was in there for. And the one time the police picked him up and held him in the thing overnight, and we went over there right away. They said, oh, he's fine. He's sleeping it off. When he wakes up, we'll let him go. Well, that night they had him, stripped him down butt naked and hit him with something.
Yeah.
And when they let him go, he was all bruised up.
It must do a job on your sort of psychological
state of mind. Yes, it does.
In and out of prison so many times. Tommy's daughter, Jerica, lived with him. Every day he got Jerica ready for school. He cooked all her meals. Jerica was 15 years old when her father committed suicide. Now, with Tommy gone, Jerica struggles to find a reason to go on.
Especially when you're incarcerated.
It was on his birthday. I was coming from Philly. So I went upstairs to change my shoes, and my friend ran out screaming. And I go outside, and I'm like, what happened? She was like, it's your dad, it's your dad. And I'm like, what? Like, did he scare you? And I was laughing. She was like, no, Jerica, he's dead.
What was that like? You can't get over that.
No, I was hospitalized like 3 times. Like, I just, like, blacked out. That's what traumatized me, I think. It just didn't make sense. Because it was like, I just talked to him. He was just telling me what he's going to cook when I get home. And to see my dad on his birthday alone, when he helped everybody, he died alone, by himself. When it was just like that, it was just, everything was gone. I got his tattoo name on my arm. So I feel like he's still, like, kind of still with me. Like, he's still there. I still talk to myself, talking to him. Like, when I go to church, I feel like I'm talking to him sometimes.
Of all my friends growing up, Tommy had the most discipline. He wasn't a thug. It didn't follow that he'd be the one who ended up in so much trouble. But that's the cruel catch of the system. It only takes one time. And the more Tommy went to jail, the more he started acting like a thug. Tommy hung out in the West Ward of Easton. The West Ward is home to the poor and black of Easton. Above the West Ward is the Juvenile Detention Center. And above that, at the very top of the hill, is the jail. A beautiful medieval castle, the bottomless receptacle for a pipeline carrying black bodies from the West Ward to the Juvenile Detention Center, straight into the jail on the hill.
They gotta change this shit around in here. We locked down for an hour, 23 hours at once for no reason. We can't go to the max block, nothing. Locked down 24/7, you know what I'm saying?
How many inmates are in this jail?
Currently, we have 746 inmates. You know, so you're in here. It's a little tense. It's loud. Your hair in the back of your neck stands up a little bit. You can hear a housing unit not too far away getting a little rowdy.
What's going on?
There's a few individuals that are maybe having a verbal altercation right now. We have a few officers want to go check it out right now to see what's going on. You know. So if anything would happen to go, you know, if we happen to have a fight or anything, just make sure you step to the side.
Although I knew the statistics, seeing so many black men in cages made me furious. So when did you get in here?
I just got in today. But I'm obviously familiar with the system and how sometimes corrupt it can be, or, you know, how messed up, you know, it can be for something so small to be something so big and something so long-lasting, you know.
Tell me about the system.
Well, I mean, it just seems like everything that you do, like, no matter if you're a good guy, you know, it's inevitable to end up here. It's been, you know, such a long process, you know, just coming in and out and just being part of the system now, it's just like you feel like you're never out, you know?
Any recent suicide attempts?
No, ma'am.
2 years ago, Corday got a DUI. He spent 5 months in jail for driving under the influence. Then had to pay exorbitant court and jail fees. He missed one payment. Then 7 police officers broke down his door and arrested him.
This DUI process for me, it's been 2 years. So this is, you can be the good person, you know, and it only takes one mistake for you to be in the system. And once you're in, you're in.
Corday wants to leave and get a fresh start elsewhere. But he's trapped in Easton because of an unending procession of probation and court appearances.
I have a 8-month-old son, and I have a 4-year-old whose father committed suicide, God forbid. And I've been just taking under my own wing and just being a father and a mentor to him, you know, show him the rights and wrong and how to, you know, grow up, you know, with positivity, you know, being an optimist, you know, taking the worst situation and turning it around into something good, you know. And for me personally, like, it also helps me, you know, like, it motivates me to be a better person because I want to be truthful to who I am and what I'm telling him. So I don't want to sell him something I don't believe in.
I could have easily ended up caught in a system like, seriously, you know, like 1 in every 3 black men in America.
Man, talking to the choir right now because I understand exactly what you're saying, and that sucks to, you know, for it to be like that. But I mean, it's the world we live in, and you would think after years and years of, you know, integration and, you know, being equal to, you know, the guy next to you, it would change, but it doesn't.
Yeah.
No, not at all.
Corday's story is a lot like Tommy's. I know it would have been my story, too, if I hadn't got out of Easton. I got out, but my friends didn't. Growing up, I was very aware of being different. Long before I admitted the truth to myself, I bore the shame of homophobic bullying. I was called faggot in school all the time. My grandfather called me a sissy. As young as I was, I always knew no one in Easton would ever accept this thing about me. My safety, my very survival depended on how well I could hide my homosexuality from everyone, even Tommy. When I packed up and left home, it was in search of other people like me. In the 1980s, every closeted kid in every small town in America knew that gay people lived and breathed in the openly queer pulse of New York City. When I left Easton, I never looked back. The irony is, homosexuality may have saved my life.
We thank you, Lord, for the resilience of the human spirit, for the resilience of this nation, that out of the ashes we rise, out of the dust, Father God, we...
Church was always a big part of our life growing up. Tommy played the drums in the band, and I sang in the choir. My biological father was a deacon from another church. When my mother and father met, they were both married to other people. They had an affair. My father chose not to acknowledge me as his son. I felt abandoned by him. After my mother left Easton, I had no reason to go back. Being there brings back all the demons I thought I left behind.
Hi! Good to see you. Good to see you. I'm happy that you came back to see everybody.
Yes. I have a nephew who's been incarcerated. He's gonna be in for 13 years.
You're a correctional officer?
Yes.
Wow, so where were you?
At Sing Sing Correctional.
You're at Sing Sing?
Yes.
After church, I had lunch with Tommy's family. How many of you know someone who's been in jail?
Who don't? Everybody.
I've been in jail.
I've been in jail.
What?
Yeah.
Wait a minute. You've been in jail?
Yeah.
In the county jail?
Lehigh County, yeah.
Wow. Center, where they send her at?
Mass incarceration has become an accepted part of life for poor people and black people in America. It is so entrenched in our nation's identity that we take it for granted and accept it as the norm. Its roots are buried deep in our troubled history. When slavery was abolished in America in 1865, the United States Congress created the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which essentially redefined the parameters of slavery. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States. This clause has allowed Americans to continue to enslave black people and poor people for over 150 years. Today, America has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Our jails and our prisons are mostly filled with poor people and people of color. I needed to see how this inhumane system worked. Hey, Paul. Roger.
Hi, Roger.
How are you?
All right. Pleasure seeing you.
So nice to meet you. I need to show you on the ground so you know about it. Paul Wright, one of the most important advocates for prison reform, has himself served time in prison.
I spent 17 years in prison myself. I've known thousands of people over the years that have been in prison, and I've yet to hear a single person say, you know what, prison was really good for me, and I fared very well.
You spent 17 years incarcerated?
I did. And I was really surprised when I went to prison at basically the brutalization, dehumanization that prisoners are subjected to. And one of the things I thought about then in 1990, which 27 years later I still believe, is that if Americans knew what was happening in prisons and jails with their tax money and in their name, they would demand reform and they would demand change.
The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Since the 1980s, the rate has skyrocketed. How did we get to this point?
You get to mass incarceration not because of rising crime levels or crimes that people are committing, but also by criminalizing more and more behavior and more conduct.
So, okay, why is that?
So it took the United States from 1776 to 1990 to lock up its first million people. Then the prison population doubled between 1990 and 2000. So it took us 10 years to lock up our second million. We have widening gaps of inequality in this country. And I view mass incarceration as a tool of social control.
What are they controlling?
Poor people. I mean, the criminal justice system in this country is literally, its only real function is containing and controlling poor people.
What's the threat of poor people?
Social change and political change. Poor men of color in particular are the foot soldiers of revolution and change in the world. And in this country, they're viewed as a threat.
Our current incarceration crisis has its ugly roots in the unrest of the 60s and 70s. John Ehrlichman, counsel and assistant to President Richard Nixon, later admitted that the Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against war or black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. And so, that's what they did.
I think it's just a continuation of the deprivation and oppression that poor black people have suffered in this country for the last 500 years.
I think most people don't know anything about the criminal justice system, right? They don't know that they're not paying attention. They don't care because it's happening to somebody else, and often that person is a different skin color or ethnicity than they are, and they just think they did something wrong, all bets are off. But I also think if you talk to people and say, should you be paying for all your life for one disorderly conduct or, should you be in jail for off and on for several years for writing one bad check or not returning a blockbuster movie? Nobody believes that.
What's the motivation to keep the numbers up?
You know, here's the thing. There's not one person who controls those numbers, right? The path to jail is made up of decisions by lots of different people, most of the time not in coordination with each other. So suddenly, the jail is full.
The bureaucracy of mass incarceration has grown into a monster of many heads. Locking up large numbers of people began as a way to control black activists during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. In the 1980s, black behaviors were criminalized as the war on drugs focused on crack. By the 1990s, with widespread racist fear of super predators, there were so many people incarcerated that prisons became an industry. Now, that industry has become so lucrative, so far-reaching, that the moral issue is complicated by the financial issue. After the shooting of Michael Brown by a police officer in Ferguson, the U.S. Justice Department investigated. They found that the local government was using unnecessary fees and fines in order to extract large amounts of money from poor and black people.
This investigation found a community where local authorities consistently approached law enforcement not as a means for protecting public safety, but as a way to generate revenue.
It's not just Ferguson. These are the same kinds of court fees that got Corday thrown back in jail in Easton. I've met many others who are in jail simply because they cannot afford to get out. This modern-day practice of punishing people for being poor is reminiscent of the inhumane debtor prisons of the past. What do you all, can I ask what you're all in here for?
Well, I'm in for DUI, my third, and I'm getting out in 5 days, but I've served a year, whole year.
This time it's for second offense DUI.
How about you?
I'm here because I owe $545 to domestics. The child support. My case was being closed, but I lost my job before I could pay the last payment, and I'm here for 6 months now.
It's just backwards. It's Crooked County, I think.
It's Crooked County?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Northampton is all about their money. You owe them $5, you better give them their $5.
Mm-hmm. And there's no help. There's no help. I mean, how is she supposed to pay child support if she's in jail?
Yeah.
It makes no sense.
And the whole reason why I was on child support is because I went to go get clean. I was a heroin addict. I was working. My living situation got messed up. I got kicked out. I had to quit my job. And now here I am. Over $545 on a case that's going to be closed as soon as I leave here.
And if you don't get the proper help, the recidivism rate is just, it skyrockets, you know? Everybody is in and out, in and out, in and out. I think they need to offer more treatment. Like, a lot of the treatment centers around here are closing, and I just think that's a terrible injustice to people because you're not going to get better sitting in a bunk in a cell. You have to work through everything. It's a vicious cycle.
It's a cruel cycle that often supplements the budgets of local governments as they extract unnecessary fees from people who can't afford to pay. The cost of running the criminal justice system is also enormous for the rest of us. State governments pour money into it, spending an average of 5% of their local budgets on correctional institutions. The federal government spends a whopping total of $265 billion a year, essentially paid for by taxpayers. Who is profiting from the billions of dollars being spent, and where does all that money go? One answer I hear a lot: private prisons. But the truth isn't what you might think. What is the percentage of private prisons in America?
It's pretty small. I mean, basically, they're kind of stagnant at around 6% of the total American prison population. But I think one of the things, too, is I think this is confusing the symptom with the disease. And I think the private prisons are the symptom, mass incarceration is the disease. Only the government drives mass incarceration. And the private prisons are just, they're just feeding off the process, profiting off the process, but they're not driving it.
So who is driving it? Taxpayers spend $265 billion a year on the criminal justice system. And still the question remains, where does all that money go? So tell me what you do and where we are.
So I'm the executive director of the American Jail Association, the only organization worldwide that we're aware of that focuses exclusively on the men and women who operate and work in our nation's jails. Right now we're on the show floor of our conference. This is where vendors showcase their products and services that are used in jails. Everything from clothing and food to medicine to security systems. If you run a jail, it's like running a city.
Tell me about these chairs.
Yeah, so one of the manufacturers, Norix, produces furniture for jails, for inmates. Furniture like this, made of plastic, so
you can wash it down.
It can be easily maintained. No sharp edges. No way to take something apart and make a weapon out of it. It's a comfortable environment for an inmate. We want to keep inmates comfortable.
That's not what I thought. The private company Norix is just one of many companies that profit from correctional institutions. Last year, their revenue was an estimated $22 million, much of it from this industry. I'm starting to see why this $265 billion a year industry makes it so hard to change the system.
Basically, the United States has done a good job of creating a self-perpetuating prisoner machine. And one thing to look at is their jobs depend on mass incarceration. And I think it was Sinclair Lewis that said it's hard to explain something to a man when his paycheck depends on him not understanding.
To be fair, it's not just private companies. Yearly, $265 billion of our taxpayer money is spent keeping public prisons and jails running. Wages for correction employees alone are $38 billion a year. Healthcare costs are $12.3 billion. And $2 billion is spent on food. As it is, with all profiteering factions of any bureaucracy, no one wants to lose their piece of the pie. When they call it a prison industrial complex, it really...
I hate that term.
You hate that term, right? Why do you hate that term?
Because don't look at it that way. I mean, we're not manufacturing automobiles. We're not... no one profits from it. Jails don't have shareholders. We're not traded on Wall Street.
The companies, some of them, maybe. The companies that are part of all of it. $265 billion a year in taxpayer spending means a sure profit for companies like Securus, who charge hiked up fees for prisoners to use phones to call their loved ones.
For individual families, it's not uncommon for them to pay upwards of $500 on average a month. But you're talking about the most economically vulnerable families in our society. So they are being weighted with the burden not only of a loved one who might have been the primary breadwinner. Now that breadwinner is gone, and now that family is in essence being overly taxed.
Okay, we're talking about a phone call.
We're talking about a phone call.
The fees that inmates pay for everyday services are several times what we pay outside of prisons. And companies like Securus continue to see their profits rise at the expense of disproportionately poor and black inmates.
There are a number of companies that profit from the poor that end up getting locked up. Whether it be the telephone companies that profit from usurious telephone rates, the companies that manage financial flows to and from people in prison and their families, food service companies. There's a lot of money to be made in this industry.
I'm also
complicit.
Yeah.
Yes. In this particular account, you have 3 mutual funds, and we can look online, see what those mutual funds are invested in, and see if they are involved in some way profiting from the prison system.
Okay.
So, I'm looking for Corrections Corp of America. And there it is. Yeah, it seems crazy, doesn't it?
It's so mind-boggling.
Yeah. It's very warped. It may be time to tell your financial advisor that there are certain issues that you'd rather not be involved in.
Yeah. And to think that I'm an investor in that, unknowingly, is even more disturbing for me. Because I keep going to people and saying, is this some giant conspiracy? Is it? And they're like, no, it's like everyone, it's just the way things are done. So from the prosecutors to the DAs to the judges to the magistrates, everyone to the COs they're just all part of a system that works. It's an industry.
Yes. Although if you look back, 10 or 20 years ago or longer, I think it was almost, they knew kind of how it was going to end up, right? And they didn't scale that back. I think there were concerted efforts to not do anything about what was
Why do you think that is?
Institutional structural racism. I mean, that's the only explanation I can see.
When someone is convicted and moves from jail to federal or state prison, the government now has legal access to them as a workforce. These prisoners work for almost nothing, making road signs or mattresses or just about anything the government decides. The Eastern Correctional Facility is one of the oldest prisons in New York. Here, many of the prisoners are enrolled in a prison labor program where the inmates work for far below minimum wage. Some people see these programs as a good thing, training inmates for skills they can use when they're released, while others see it as modern-day slavery.
Many of your speed limit signs, your stop signs, your no U-turn signs, all the road signs you're seeing as you drive down the road on any typical journey, they make many of them right here.
So what do they get paid?
The pay rate ranges from about 15 cents an hour up to 65 cents an hour.
What's the sort of motivation for not paying them minimum wage?
Well, wage and inmate pay rate is set by regulation, but you have to understand, a minimum wage employee in the community, that's assuming that they're meeting all the financial demands of perhaps maintaining a household, a family, and all the attendant fiscal responsibilities there. Purchasing of groceries, the housing costs, transportation costs, health care costs. For an inmate who's incarcerated in a correctional facility, those costs are not realized by the inmate.
For time spent within the penal system, inmates will accumulate fees averaging $13,600. Their families suffer huge financial losses in lost wages. By the age of 48, a former inmate will have earned $179,000 less than someone who has never been incarcerated.
Every time that prisoners have gone to court seeking to be paid for their labor, seeking to be compensated for their labor, the court's response is, you're slaves of the state. Those are the exact words of court after court after court for the last 120 years. Prisoners are slaves of the state, and as such, they're not entitled to any compensation at all.
I read in Prison Legal News that companies like Victoria's Secret, Whole Foods, and Starbucks have used prison labor. Paul Wright exposed those stories. What percentage of prison labor is corporate America?
It's actually pretty small. I mean, and I think that, this may be bad for your story, but the reality is that at any given time, there's around 5,000 to 6,000 prisoners employed by the private sector in this country, which you figure out of a workforce of, 200 million people or 180 million people. That's not huge.
But the truth is, most prisoners aren't working for private companies. They work for the government. Cheap labor keeps the prison system running. So, what are they doing?
They're doing, primarily what prisoners do is they run the prisons. So anything that has to get done in a prison, unless it's security related, usually prisoners are doing it. So they're doing plumbing, they're doing maintenance, they're doing custodial and janitor services, cleaning, they're cooking food, they're serving food. Literally anything you can think of that is needed to run a prison, prisoners do.
So the prison saves a fortune by making the prisoners run the prison?
Millions, tens of millions, yeah.
They save tens of millions.
There was a GAO report in 1993 that said it would cost prisons hundreds of millions of dollars more each year to pay prisoners minimum wage for the work that they did. So prisons are saving hundreds of millions of dollars by employing prisoners. And when we crunched the numbers, we found that the median wage in state prisons was 20 cents an hour. And the median wage in federal prison was 31 cents an hour. And in a number of states, they don't pay anything at all.
What?
Yeah, oh yeah. In Texas, Georgia, Arkansas, and Alabama, prisoners are not paid for their work at all. And in some places, they're required to work under threat of disciplinary action. If they say, no, I'm not going to work, they can write you up for that. They can send you to solitary for that.
That's slavery. To work for free,
yeah.
And then they can put you in solitary if you don't work, or write you up for not working for free. Why is that not slavery? In the prison labor debate, we rarely hear from inmates. What do you say when people say, oh, they shouldn't have labor programs in prisons?
No, I don't agree with that whatsoever, you know, because look, I can be out there just walking the yard, you know what I'm saying? I can be out there just angry, but this is a buffer. This gives me an incentive, you know what I'm saying, to want to do the right thing, to do something different.
The pay can be a lot better.
I'm pretty sure someone's making more money off it. You know? They're just going to pay you what they feel that needs to be paid.
The prison industrial complex could not exist without inmates. The entire prison industry would collapse without large numbers of people to incarcerate. To keep this $265 billion a year industry in place, there needs to be a pipeline to provide a steady stream of new people. People who are dispensable. In the history of forced labor in America, those without power have often looked different from those in power. Arresting those people who don't have power is the very first step in filling jails and prisons. When the police officer puts the handcuffs on a young black man, chances are he has entered the door of no return. Peter?
Yes.
Roger.
Hi.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Come on in.
Thanks. I get stopped all the time. And when they stop me, they say to me, the cop always says to me, the state trooper always says to me, what do you do for a living? And I'm like, I have to give my resume in order to get out of the situation.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that?
I mean, that sounds like racism to me.
What role does race play when the cops pull over someone like me?
Well, probably you were pulled over for a traffic violation. Race plays a role. This is America. Race always plays a role. There is research on that. It probably is less of a role in why you were pulled over. I'm not saying no role. It has probably much more of a role if they ask to search you. It's what happens after the stop is where you see a lot of racial disparity and bias in terms of who cops ask to search and who they don't.
A recent study in San Francisco found that blacks accounted for less than 15% of stops, but over 42% of non-consensual searches, even though whites were more likely to carry contraband.
But the way America is set up, yeah, if it's a white kid in a rich white suburb with a well-paid, more sympathetic police department that has to be more responsive to rich community concerns, absolutely the treatment is different. Policing is local. The courts are local. So all that matters. And so again, we're talking about systemic problems of income inequality, of segregation. Those problems are very real. But it seems like we don't want to focus on that. People in rich suburbs don't want to talk about the zoning restrictions they have that are there to keep poor people out. And blacks are disproportionately poor in this country. Those are real issues, but no one looks in the mirror and says, how am I contributing to the problem? It's all about, oh, those damn cops in Baltimore's, screwing up. The power of cops is to arrest someone. That's the legal authority that we give police.
Well, you can tell them not to pull over Roger because he's driving a nice car in a rural white.
And you should tell them that, yeah.
Once you're arrested, you have to wait in jail until trial, unless you pay bail. Tommy's sister Susie told me that bail was a huge financial burden on their family. I understood more when I saw how bail works. The court sets bail, and if you pay it, you get to go free until your trial. But the average bond amount is $55,000. That's more than a year's wages for most people.
Most states in this country have what's called a right to bail. That's been perverted in two ways. The first is that money has become not just the primary, but almost the only way that people can get out of jail. And so the number of people who are sitting in jails across the country because they can't afford bail is really, really depressing. What you can do is if a bail is set that you can't afford, you can go to a bail bondsman. And the bail bondsman will front you the money. So say a judge sets your bond at, $50,000. The average person doesn't have that kind of money lying around. They might, however, have $5,000 lying around. So if you can pay a bail bondsman 10% of your bail, they will front you the rest. Almost every state has a bail bond industry where if you go to a jail, you may have seen this, everywhere you'll see neon lights, bail bonds, bail bonds, bail bonds. That's what they do. They'll go to the court, and when people's bail is set, they'll front them the money in exchange for a 10% fee. And what happens is these bail bondsmen form very powerful lobbying interests, and they will lobby at the State House. So anytime the issue of bail reform comes up, you can be sure that the bail bond industry's lobbyists are there pushing to maintain the money bail system how it is.
From 2002 to 2011, the bail lobby spent $3.1 million to influence lawmakers. It makes sense why the bail lobby wants to stop reform. Arrested people pay over $1.4 billion a year to the bail industry. That's over $1 billion annually being sucked out of mostly poor communities.
I'm not so crazy as not to know that you've already figured out that if I can talk you into doing this bill, my clients are going to make some money on the bond premiums.
Things do not have to be this way. In fact, the United States is the only country in the world besides the Philippines that allows a for-profit bail industry. But arrest and bail is only the first step in the pipeline. Once you've been arrested, a prosecutor steps in to decide whether to press charges. Adam Foss is a former prosecutor in Boston, and he's seen firsthand how black men get sucked into the prison pipeline. Adam knows that while prosecutors are often overlooked, they are actually the key to the problem of mass incarceration.
The way that I prosecuted cases for 9 years in this community, if you ask anyone that lives in this neighborhood, they would tell you that, if anything, it made it worse. And it's not because I'm evil or a bigot or that I'm not thinking about these things all the time. It was just that I was provided a set of tools when I walked in, and that's all I got. And those tools were jail or no jail.
Where you end up often depends on the color of your skin.
By a show of hands, how many of you by the age of 25 had either acted up in school, went somewhere you were specifically told to stay out of, or drank alcohol before your legal age? All right. How many of you shoplifted, tried an illegal drug, or got into a physical fight, yes, even with a sibling? Now, How many of you ever spent one day in jail for any of those decisions? How many of you sitting here today think that you are a danger to society or should be defined by those actions of youthful indiscretion?
I don't think I've ever met anyone who can explain white privilege to privileged white people with as much charm as Adam Foss.
I saw this system playing out that disproportionately affected people that look like us, and in a really, really negative way. I actually got caught selling a lot of weed, and I was doing it across state lines. So it was a federal crime, but I was caught by my father in my driveway, and I was adopted by white people, and because of who he was in terms of being a respected community member and a police officer, nothing happened to me as a result. I mean, I got a kick in the ass from my dad, and we had a conversation about that, and, you know, I was grounded or something, but I certainly didn't need to go to jail or prison. So I just feel like it's unfair that the privilege that I had in having a mentor like my father and having that safeguard from the bottomless pit of the criminal justice system is the difference between me sitting here talking to you. I was adopted. It was just a lottery ticket. It was literally like, they could have been like, no, we'll take this kid. But I won the lottery. I got to go home with them, be raised in their house, in their community, in their schools. College was never a question, despite the fact that neither of my parents had ever gone. I went to college, and that entire time I was messing up. I was doing things that these young people were doing, but because I had interventions at the time that were pro-social and not punitive and shaming and awful, I got out of that. And then I just grew up, and it, you know, like, it didn't happen when I was 19. It happened when I was 25, 26, 27 years old. Went to law school, and here I am.
Adam introduced me to Julian, a young man who's already had several run-ins with the law. He currently lives with his mom, who raised him alone.
Julian is dealing with a firearm case. He was caught in a car with a gun. They charged him and the other person that was in the car with the gun.
The details of Julian's arrest are typical in cases involving young black men. Julian and a girlfriend were riding in his car when a police officer pulled him over. He accused Julian of reckless driving. Not thinking he had a choice, Julian gave permission to search his car. Julian says he didn't know the girl in his car was in possession of a gun, although she says it was his. The DA charged Julian with a felony, illegal possession of a firearm.
Now that's how people end up right back in the same positions. Like, they think it helps, it doesn't help. You know, like, that jail shit don't help to me. What do you think? I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair. I think they look at you, they look at a person off his black and white. You see what I'm saying? I don't know. I can't even tell you, to be honest. It's like they don't know no better. They don't know no better. People that's out here robbing people all the time, this is what they do, this is what they know. Nobody showed them a different path to get money or a different path to do this. You see what I'm saying? Nobody gave them that different route. This is my route, this is all I know how to do. You see what I'm saying? A person that works ain't gonna go sell no drugs. Cause he's like, hold on. You see what I'm saying? I'm not selling drugs, I work, this is my lane. Everybody finds their lane and that's what they run with, you know? But I don't know, it's hard to explain it.
If the felony sticks, the life he envisions for himself won't be possible.
If he's convicted of the crime, he'll be going to jail for 18 months. It just doesn't smell like justice to me.
Julian faces some tough odds. In the 1990s, prosecutors began prosecuting felony charges at twice the rate they did before. Young black men have a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison in their lifetime. To help young men like Julian, Adam travels all over the country trying to change the way prosecutors think about these cases.
If we're going to reform this, everybody needs to do something a little different.
Yeah, almost daily, it feels daily.
There are 2.2 million people in jail and prison. And despite making up only 14% of the population, African Americans make up almost half of that number. It's not because African Americans commit more crime, and it's not because we're all a bunch of bigots. It's because implicit bias rules our decision making. So we don't make decisions based on data and technology and things that are giving us a feedback loop. We make decisions based on our life experiences as individual prosecutors. We were learning so much from these young people.
And so when people think about mass incarceration, they think about jails and prisons being full to the brim of people and people sort of falling out of the windows and the doors. And that is a definition of mass incarceration. But to me, mass incarceration is also a question of proportionality. So in Massachusetts, we do very well in terms of the gross number of people in our prisons. I think we're second in the country. But when you look at the racial disparity, we are second for a different reason. We're almost the worst in the country. And to me, that's a mass incarceration problem. Therefore, we need to look at the people who have the ability to send people to prison. Those are prosecutors.
One visit to a homeless shelter, one visit to a treatment center, one visit to a domestic violence shelter, to understand that there are things out there that we never learned in law school. We'll never learn in one of these trainings. That we have to go out and experience for ourselves. And it will make you a better prosecutor, it will make you happier at the end of the day. It's not going to make you unbiased, but at least it's going to give you more life experience, so when that does rise up, you'll be able to combat it with a little bit of the life experience that you've had.
Julian's mom is frightened for his future. Julian had to wear a restrictive ankle bracelet, which makes it practically impossible for him to get a job. But the courts will only remove the ankle bracelet when Julian gets a job. He's trapped in an inhumane cycle that perpetuates his criminalization. It's almost impossible to get out.
Prison is a supply problem. If they don't have the supply, they can't run their business. And they have no way of actually taking people from the street and putting them in the building. It requires the police, it requires prosecutors, it requires judges, and it requires probation officers. The police, prosecutors, judges, and probation officers don't make a dime off of prisons. We have no incentive to send people to prison. The reason that we do is that that's the tool that we were told will make us safer and make people better. But we don't profit off of sending people to prison. And so if we can change what happens down here, police should be trying to reduce crime in their neighborhoods. Prosecutors should be trying to improve public safety in their neighborhoods using data and science that we know works. Probation officers should not be probation officers, they should be probation liaisons. They should be helping people stay out of jail.
Probation is another reason why so many people are in jail. Probation officers used to be like social workers, helping inmates make the transition to life on the outside. But over the last 20 years, they've become more like law enforcement officers.
Mass incarceration, sure, it's a result of the war on drugs and sentencing laws. But it's really, especially in the jail system, it is probation violations. There are so many people sitting in jail for probation violations, which a lot of the time are not new crimes. So when you go on probation, you have general rules that you have to follow. Let us know where you live, let us know what your phone number is so we can contact you, get employment, get housing. None of those things, if I don't do them, are crimes. If I choose to not have a job, that's not a crime. If I choose to hang out with my friends, that's not a crime. If I choose not to get an education or to, smoke weed, those aren't crimes. And yet, as a prosecutor and as a probation officer, if you do those things while you're on probation, I can send you to jail. And that's a dirty little secret that we don't talk about, is how that functions.
76% of prisoners who are released are rearrested within 5 years, many for probation violations.
Another thing we don't talk about is that you, as a person on probation, you pay the government to be supervised. So it was $65 a month when I was a prosecutor. I think it's up to $90 at this point. But when you're a young black male who has no employment opportunities and you have kids and you have no education and you're caught selling drugs to make money, You go through all of this stuff, we make it harder for you to get a job, harder for you to get a house, harder for you to get any financial aid, harder for you to get services. And then you have to pay for that. And so what do you think is going to happen? Like, how did we, when we created this system, think this will be a good way to keep people from committing crime?
Let it sit for a while. But see, mom's quarters, I couldn't charge it real quick. We were turning.
Like, instead of playing with dolls and having a normal little kid childhood like I wish everybody else could have, I used to like have to hide beer and like beg the cops not to take my dad. And
you would beg the cops not to take your dad?
Yeah, it was bad. The cops would take my dad, so I used to like cry so they didn't take my dad. And then because when they took my dad, me and my brother would just like it was just not, I don't know how to explain it. It's like, I don't know. It was bad.
Sis, how much time did Tommy spend in jail?
A lot. Tommy...
Like every month, every couple
It was more than every month.
So the jail never got him any help or treatment? They would just throw him in jail?
They just throw him in jail. But what they did was they put him in what they call a bubble up there. If they think you're suicidal. And I guess they put you in a paper gown. And you're up there, and as other people in the prison are in there, they can walk past and see you there.
In Northampton?
In Northampton County. But he was in there for quite some time. They kept him medicated. He was so medicated that a lot of times he didn't know his name if you called it. But this went on for years. It went on literally for years.
If Tommy were alive, it would break his heart to see what is happening to his daughter, Jerica. She has missed so much school that she might have to drop out.
So dark.
The psychological trauma of jail isn't just shouldered by the person in prison. The families of the incarcerated bear much of it too. Watching Jerica weep for her father triggered a deep well of sorrow I shoulder as a black person living in America. The system exploited Tommy.
Sorry.
He might still be alive if the courts were designed to rehabilitate instead of criminalize. How much of your job when you were a police officer did you spend dealing with mental health issues, people with mental health issues?
Significant part. I mean, sometimes it's hard to tell, especially when it overlaps with alcohol and with drugs, but also just general family crises. I wish police didn't have to deal with people in mental crisis. Yes, cops could and should be better trained in dealing with mental issues, but at some level I don't think that should be the officer's job. The idea that we've even equated mental health care and is linked to mass incarceration is again another moral strike against us as supposedly civilized, humane people. Can you imagine a worse treatment program than jail?
The correlation between mental illness and incarceration is truly frightening. Starting in the 1970s, the numbers for mental hospitalization plummeted while the incarceration rate of people with mental health issues skyrocketed.
It shouldn't be the responsibility of the justice system actors anyway to be the first responder for people with mental illness, for people who are self-medicating with alcohol or drugs because of depression or trauma or all this kind of stuff. It shouldn't be the criminal justice system, but that's what we've got. And so a lot of the work around reform is how do we make that system better at spotting those folks and finding alternatives to get them out.
There are good people inside of the jail system. I mean, I know that seems like an oxymoron to some people. There are individuals that are just in bad situations.
One of my best friends from high school, Tommy spent his whole life in and out of the county jail. He never got any treatment. And I didn't understand how that could happen, and I wonder how many other Tommies there are.
You're right. There's a lot of Tommies out there. I mean, they should not be spending time inside of our institutions. They need to be inside of hospitals where help can be provided. You know, we're de facto mental health institutions now, and that in itself is troubling. I can say that when I first came into the system, of the jail system in about 1995, I was an individual that thought that people used the mental health claim to try to get off their cases and different things of that nature. And I had the opportunity to interact with some individuals, and the mental illness is real. Mental illness is real, and there's a real problem inside of our jails. In Miami-Dade, 62% are classified with some type of mental illness. So if we figure out a way to treat that issue or divert them into the proper resources in the community, then our numbers go down and we can better service those inmates that are inside of our system for something other than that.
That's a massive number, and I had no idea.
Jails serve a need because there are ills in our communities. We understand that. And there's some bad people out there, I get that. But not everyone needs to be in jail. I mean, jail should be the last stop for an individual who we've exhausted all means as a society. And, you know, if you look at it just from dollars and cents, would you prefer to pay a jail system $200 a day in order to house this person? Or would you prefer, and them returning them back to you within a matter of days sometimes? Or would you prefer to spend your money on a diversionary program or a mental health scenario where they can get the treatment and they'll never end up in that street again?
So it's costing us money.
It's costing you money. I would argue that it costs you more money to house the wrong person inside of a jail system than to get that same individual treatment.
It's kind of like, you must have the only job where if you guys are out of work, it's probably a good thing for society.
Absolutely.
Isn't that kind of weird?
That'll be a pink slip I'll gladly accept.
I don't want to take John's job away, but what would American jails look like if our intent were rehabilitation? It might look like the Netherlands. Their criminal justice system is so effective that about 1/3 of their prisons remain empty, and crime has gone down 30% in the last 10 years. Is it me, or is it just, it's very peaceful?
It's very quiet.
It's very quiet. There's not a lot of noise, but it's also relaxing.
Deurtje dicht, deurtje open.
You have 3,000
empty cells.
Empty cells.
Yes, it's true.
That's shocking.
Is it?
Feels more like a nice boutique hotel.
Okay.
The beautiful colors, the bamboo. What can we learn from you?
The fact that we try to start with reintegration on day one, when people reintegration on day one. Almost all of them have to go outside one day, and then they have to be in a society again. And we hope that we can reach them. We will also try to reach their mind, the way they think, the way why are you acting the way you do.
So you have empathy.
Yes, it is.
This is quite nice. Which is really interesting is too, you have a separate bathroom facility, because in a lot of prisons, the toilet is in the room, in the open, which to me, it takes away your dignity. From my friends and my family that I know that have been incarcerated, and from being in prisons, everything is geared toward taking away your self-respect and your dignity. And you leave there with so little self-respect. You're beaten down.
I think it's important to say that in the Netherlands, the punishment is in the length of the sentence, but not in the prison circumstances. The prison circumstances must be human as possible.
America has the highest rate of incarceration, while the Netherlands has one of the lowest. That's because the penal system in the Netherlands is intent on rehabilitation. Dutch inmates keep their right to vote, some welfare benefits, and are even allowed to go home on special occasions to spend time with their families. In the Netherlands, prisoners keep their rights. In America, they are stripped of them. Julian is busy getting ready for his trial. In a last-ditch effort to turn his life around, he and his mom have moved to Rhode Island.
I
don't want to be in Boston because I feel like if I stay in Boston, I'm going to be locked up or I'm going to be dead. I'm just crazy. I'm like, yo, I got to go. I got to go. Once this is done, I'm done. I'm out of here. I'm not going back to Boston like that. None of that. It ain't never going to change. You got to change. You got to change within. You see what I'm saying? That's where I'm at right now, like, mentally. Like, okay, I know I got to change. You see what I'm saying? Like, I can't be out here like how I am. I know I got to change. I got to fall back. I got to get a job. I got to, you know, certain things I got to do to stay right, man.
Nobody in the criminal justice system sees Julian's efforts. To people in power, this young black boy is an invisible man.
Hey guys, get right under there.
Julian's court date is in 2 days. In the justice system, young black men like Julian are often seen as thugs. His very appearance can be used as a factor to decide his fate.
You get into any of these, like patterns or colors, you're gonna have to buy specific types for these shirts to work.
Definitely, bro. This is crazy.
What you think?
Yeah, bro. Can't believe it look like this right now, bro. Pow. Pow. Yeah, this is done.
The judge is the one who administers the final push in the prison pipeline.
Incarceration, you know, it's sort of embedded in our society. That's sort of how we treat people. What, you know, a judge who's running for election has to say when he's on the stump. It's what, you know, right? And changing those is really hard.
The worst of the worst. Rapists, murderers, let off easily.
Being weak on criminals is dangerous. Bill O'Neill expressed sympathy for rapists.
It's no secret that being tough on crime looks good at election time for a judge. A recent study found that the more TV election ads there are, the more likely judges are to rule against criminal defendants.
At this point, I've been locked up I'll be 10 years in January. And I'm struggling right now with, like, accountability. I'm accountable for what I did, right? But at this point, I'm not the savage that I was when I took this young man's life, right? I'm educated, I'm civilized, I'm dignified. And at this point, this sentence, man, is having like a reverse effect.
Adam often meets with a group of inmates. Most of them have life sentences for murder.
So a lot of the films that I've seen about prison and people that I work with who are doing prison stuff, they'll find the one really compassionate story about, somebody who's been wrongfully accused and has spent all this time in prison and was exonerated, or they'll find the person who's doing 30 years for a bag of weed, and those are great stories for the conversation because it sort of gets people thinking, like, this is crazy that our system operates like this, but they're such a small fraction, and we have to expand the conversation to people who did the most violent thing that you can in the course of a 2-second decision when it was really, it's me or you, and they killed someone. But sitting with those men in that room the other day, I would challenge you to find me one person that you would label as a violent person.
When I went away as a kid, juvenile, it taught me nothing. It taught me more about the game. It made me resent the system as a whole. I learned more to do in the streets and gave me more of a drive to do in the streets in DYS than I ever did in the streets. Going into counties, fighting day and night, spending time in a hole only made me colder. It didn't make me no better. sentence me more and more and treat me as if I meant nothing made me feel as if no one meant nothing. It made me even colder. Having to lose brothers, relatives while locked up never helped me. You took my father and my uncles and left the streets as my father, then taught me the ways of a prison life. That you take no shorts, that you ride, that you fight, that you trust no one and nobody. This is truly an antisocial world.
I for myself, I was out in the street corners because I was looking for something I didn't get at home. My mother was a single parent. She tried her best, but in order to put food in our stomach and clothes on us, she worked hard. So she didn't have the time to give us the emotional support that I was seeking.
I was fortunate, I would say, to speak to some federal prosecutors and DAs. And after hearing some of our stories that are very similar, they said, I wish I would have known this before sending so many people to prison, right? And to me, when that was stated, I believe it was by a federal prosecutor, I was a little bothered by that. I was bothered because of the fact that they were ignorant to who the people were that they were sentenced. They just looked at them as an inmate, which I hate. I hate that word. I cringe using that word because I like Adam. I feel like we are people. We are a person. We are just incarcerated.
The names that they use: killer, gangbanger, drug dealer, monster, nigger. I have to believe that people create these names and make them so offensive and so hard because they cannot accept the fact that sitting in this room are artists and poets and doctors and teachers and fathers and brothers and uncles and mentors. They deal with their feelings by hating you, by prejudging you, and by labeling you. And it's really, really easy to do that when we stick you as far away from your community as possible, behind walls that we can't see over and neither can you.
Well, I'm very sort of shaken by everything I've heard you guys talk about. I live this very sort of I never think about the world I left behind, and I'm very disconnected with where I came from. With my family, I'm disconnected. The community, I'm disconnected. And somehow you all, the stories are connecting me back to that. And and I see this sort of cycle. I see the same story without father figures, without role models, without the same story, and it just doesn't seem to stop.
I've been with them for 5 years now, and I've seen what prison has done to them over the course of that 5 years. I mean, they've grown, they've become men, they've really atoned through this restorative justice process, but you can see the patina of prison. That's been 5 years. Those guys have another 50 to 60 to go of that routine every day, not seeing any other part of the world, not seeing any other human being other than the men that you're surrounded by, not being intimate with a female, not having the feeling of getting a job and making a paycheck and buying something, not having the feeling of actually being remorseful and actually doing something to pay back what they've done.
I was in prison because I shot and killed a drug dealer during an armed robbery. He tried to shoot me and I shot him. But the point there was to get the point across to me that I shouldn't be robbing drug dealers. They could have made that point without 17 years. And I think that one of the things that again, it comes down to, I think, what's the point of incarceration? But the reality is we seem to spend a lot of time and money trying to make people a lot worse. And I think that comes down to one of the core things is I think the real purpose of American prisons is really to destroy people, destroy them as individuals, destroy them as functioning members of society.
At some point in time, the amount of punishment crosses a threshold and becomes vengeance. And when it crosses that threshold, it starts to impact us in a way that was not the intent. I'm no longer sorry. I'm no longer remorseful. Now I'm angry. And my anger manifests into violence. And now I'm worse than I ever was when I came in.
Because of mass incarceration in the United States. What was that impact?
You lose the ability to live in public housing. You lose the ability to get a driver's license, to get financial aid, to get public welfare. And the idea behind that was it would deter people from committing crime, but the consequence of it has been people who are touched by the criminal justice system come out in a way worse position, so they go back to committing crime. Across the country very recently.
If Julian goes to jail, it will cost taxpayers $30,000 every year he is incarcerated.
Me even talking to Adam, like, that's big for me. Because I don't have people I can just go talk to like that, you know what I'm saying? Like, I see Adam as a big bro. You see him like a big brother. You know what I'm saying? Like, he got that, he's trying to guide me, he's trying to put me in the right path, he's trying to do, something a big bro would do.
Most of the people caught up in the criminal justice system aren't the hardened criminals we imagine. Too many are kids who just did something stupid, like Tommy or I did in high school. The puppeteers of the system would prefer that we see these kids as super predators, thugs, or animals to be caged.
Bill, Roger Ross Williams.
Hey, Roger.
Thank you for having me. Come on out.
As a conservative, I have some misgivings about government's effectiveness and wisdom, but government doesn't get everything wrong. Every now and again, it will get something right. And one thing the government did get right is it adopted policies in the late 80s. Reagan, Bush, President Clinton was a big part of this. For example, during the Clinton years, we hired many more police. When you have many more police, your criminals are going to be more careful about what they do. We've had more aggressive, proactive, and computer-driven policing strategies, reining in the discretion of judges and more generally increasing the use of incarceration. And it worked. My opponents will frequently point out, and they're right about this, there are many more people in prison now than there were during the 60s and 70s. There are about 2.2 million people in prison. What they point out less frequently is that we've gotten something for that. It is not a mistake, and it's not just a happenstance that we have so much less crime now than we did in the early 1990s.
Why do you think America, I'm trying to understand why America has the largest incarceration rate in the world. Why do you think that is?
It's the crime rate. That's what the crime rate affects us all 326 million Americans. And if you want to avoid incarceration, it's actually easy to do so. And you don't have to be a lawyer, and you only have to know 4 things to avoid incarceration. Don't steal stuff. Don't cheat people out of their property. Stay away from drugs. And resolve your disputes without violence. If people follow those 4 rules, the prison population in this country will shrink to nothing.
And what about the opponents say when you lock someone up, especially someone young, you basically create a criminal, a harsher criminal, let's say?
Well, what I would say to them, if it were true that being in prison tends to make a person a criminal, then as we had more and more people in prison, and then they get released after 5 or 10 or 12 years, we would have more criminals and more crime. But exactly the opposite happened. As we put more people, as the prison population increased over the last 25 years, we've had less and less crime.
What role does race play in the mass incarceration system? Because there's, 1 in 3 black men. Why is it sort of unbalanced?
There is a disproportion. It's true that blacks are disproportionately represented in the prison population. They're about 12 or 13% of the overall population in the country, and I think from 36 to 40% of the prison population. But that is, I don't believe that is because America is a racist cauldron. There's still racism. Anybody who denies that there's racism is just not well connected. But I don't think that racism, I think it's the commission of crime.
So why are black people committing more crime?
What is needed is the right parenting, to teach the right values. I haven't met you before today, but I would bet a goodly chunk of change that you didn't become a successful person, an independent filmmaker, because your parents just let you run wild and didn't care about checking your homework.
I'm a single mother. I shoplifted. For a while, I actually sold pot. I thought, and I was always fearful, that I would end up in the system because the statistics were, against me, and all of my friends were in this system. And I wonder, though, if I had gotten caught selling pot or shoplifting, if my life would have been very different.
You avoid crime and you avoid scrapes with the police because your parents teach you to respect other people, to respect their right to be safe, and to resolve your disputes without violence. And if you want money, go earn it. Get a summer job. When you grow up that way, the chances of you winding up and having an unfortunate interaction with the criminal justice system are extremely low.
I think that there's a huge disconnect between the political ruling class in this country and the ordinary Americans on criminal justice reform.
What is the jail for? Right? Come to a decision, then say, all right, let's look who we've actually caught in that jail. And if those don't match up, how do we get those people out? And so there are a whole bunch of things that can be done at each of these decision points that can change the face of jail.
There's this, law of diminishing returns with incarceration, and people have studied this, where up to a certain point, incarceration deters crime, and then after that point, it either doesn't deter any further crime, or in fact, it causes more crime.
The system of mass incarceration is morally abhorrent. It's also futile, and it contributes to huge structural problems in our economy. So at the end of the day, over a longer term period, investors, they're not going to be able to profit from this. And so, it's up to investors to also try and change it.
A lot of the feedback that I've gotten is you're never going to be able to reform the system because it runs on money. And the sad irony is that the people who are making money off of prisons are the people who are making money off of prisons. It's not the other actors in the system who go to work every day to fundamentally do a good thing. Police aren't going to work every day being like, I want to kill black people. They go into a system that was handed to them that has been used to capture and kill black people since its existence. I and my colleagues didn't go to work saying, I want to lock up a bunch of black people, I want to get as many convictions as possible. We walked into a system that was set up to achieve that goal, and that has really bad metrics, so we're not valued for anything else than winning. And then you have this other end of the system, which is only designed to make money off of holding bodies. And the bodies that are expendable are the black and brown ones, and people care less. If the jails were filled with white kids from the suburbs, and then they were making those white kids work for no money, how long do you think that that operation would be allowed to last? The prosecutor made the decision to dismiss Julian's case today. Good. It's like winning a battle and the war is still being waged.
Julian's celebration is short-lived. Soon after, they reopened the case against him as a misdemeanor. His future remains uncertain because young men like him are still targeted by the police. It's no wonder that Julian is angry at the process. The system is stacked against him. The next time a police officer pulls him over, Adam might not be there to save him.
It's just really sad to me the amount of effort that it took for this one young person when I know that it's happening to thousands of young people around the country. So it's a bittersweet victory. The likelihood that he gets employment because that is not on his record goes up, which means the likelihood that he stays out of trouble will go up, because one of the #1 factors that we've seen as experts in criminal justice reform is that employment really keeps people out of the justice system. Julian is under a much brighter sky right now. He just needs to understand that it can fall down at any second.
I keep coming back to the jail on the hill. 30 years apart, Julian, Tommy, and I all inherited the same legacy. Poor, black, young, in a racially hostile country. One of us escaped, the other remains trapped, yet another took his own life. It breaks my heart to know that all over America, countless black people, countless poor people, without the power to decide their own fate, are cuffed and carted up a hill to be disappeared from public view. Inside, they are stripped of their dignity and denied their humanity. The cumulative cost is enormous, in lost dollars, in lost opportunity, and lost lives. If we allow this cruelty to take place away from our gaze, we compromise our humanity. If we're able to look at it as it is happening and do nothing, we become inhuman. We cannot turn away from what we have done.